for baking pie. She said that was the best fuel for making pie, and so she would get cow chips for her cook stove and carry them in her apron. But so this girdle was around there. Then they had a headdress, and again, we're talking about the Middle East. In the Middle East, the sun can be rather brutal during the daytime, so they had a headdress, and he especially mentioned sandals. Now, they wore the sandals outside. When you went inside, you took your sandals off. You didn't wear your sandals inside. And then they had a collecting bag. Now, the collecting bag was their purse, or their pockets. This is where they would carry things in, and they said that they were not supposed to take any of these things, and that they were supposed to go to a place, ask if they could stay there, and if the people said they could, then they would stay there for the time that they would minister, and then they would move on to other places. But if they were not welcome at this home, they were to then shake the dust off their sandals, and this was just a symbol that they didn't want to have anything more to do with these people at this place. And so they were going on out, and it was a ministry of witnessing about Jesus, the Messiah, and they also did considerable amount of healing during this time. One of the things that I thought about as I was studying through this, it specifically says that he had the 12, and he sent them out 2 by 2, and so you had Judas Iscariot, who was one of these 2 that was going on out. Now, did he see miracles of healing as he was going on out? What was his thought process as he was going through this? Was he thinking at this time already that he was going to betray Jesus and so on? I don't know. Does anybody have any comments or questions about Judas during this time of his ministry? Mike? Okay. Right, yes. And so, yes, the other disciples didn't know who it was, and so nobody went on out saying, oh man, I got to go out with Judas. So they, yes, Eric. Okay.
Fully saved, and the work of the Holy Spirit is in him and with him.
Okay.
Obviously, there were miracles happening through his ministry because the scripture doesn't tell us that he was the exception.
Right, yes.
And again, it's a good point Mike brought up that the other disciples had no clue who the deceiver would be. So.
Okay. All right.
So this would be a case example then of someone who chose to reject the salvation that he had.
Okay.
He didn't lose it. He wasn't just walking one day and it fell out of his pocket.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so he actually made a choice, a free choice, to reject the plan of God, which he knew, and betray Jesus, reject Jesus, fight against and oppose him.
Okay, all right.
And by doing so, was no longer saved.
Yeah, and
At one point he was. I mean, this is their view
And there's no indication of when he made this choice, whether this was something that he had made a long time ago, or whether this is something that when he was presented with the possibilities of making some money off of this, that he was now going to, that this was going to sway him or not. It was just interesting as I was reading through this and studying this, that Jesus sent him out just the same as he did the rest of the disciples to do this job. Okay, then we will continue on with verse 14. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others said, he is Elijah. And others said, he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. And so we see that Herod lived in Tiberias, and Tiberias is right in here. It's not a city that Herod lived. And so he was in Tiberias. You can stay in a kibbutz about right over here. There's a beautiful kibbutz, and at night you see the lights of Tiberias shining on the Sea of Galilee, and it's a very striking picture, and to think that this is where Herod lived. And so he is talking about John the Baptist, or they mentioned John the Baptist. Some said this was John the Baptist that was healing these. Now, why would they think it was John the Baptist? Grant?
Well, I think Herod was probably somewhat haunted by John the Baptist when he was basically tricked into killing him.
Okay.
And he was not necessarily totally contrary to John the Baptist and who he was. There was a sensitivity there. So I think that was my estimation.
Okay. That he was probably that he was still thinking back of the order that he gave to cut off John the Baptist's head and bring that into this dance that was going on, and so that this was still in his conscience. And so he was haunted by the deed that he had done, that John the Baptist probably had been resurrected, that this was John the Baptist. And then we see that others thought that it was Elijah. Why would they think that it was Elijah? What was the importance of Elijah as far as the Jews were concerned? Go ahead, Eric.
Well, there's Old Testament prophecies from Malachi that say that at the time of the Messiah that Elijah will return.
Okay,
And that's part of the Passover traditional ceremony.
all right,
And as far as we know, that was a part of it at the time of Jesus as well.
okay, all right. How many of you were here at the Seder meal that we had here at Cornerstone? Okay, with the Seder meal, there was one little incident that occurred that should remind us why they would think that this was Elijah. How many places were set at each table? One extra. And who was it? Eddie that went to the door and called out, Elijah, Elijah, are you there? Okay, and so this was something that they thought that Elijah was going to be coming. And so this is one of the reasons why Elijah would have been called. Elijah was had a chair at the Passover feast. And so they would think that it could have been Elijah. Then we continue on with, and when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias. I want to make sure. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you. And he vowed to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mother, for what should I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. So we see John was in prison, and the prison that he was in was located on the top of this hill. Well, on the top of that hill. This is Machaerus, and this was their Alcatraz. You can see that there's not a lot of greenery. This is one of the most desolate places around. It was close to the Dead Sea, and John had been put into prison at this particular place on the east side of the Dead Sea. Now, the whole history of Herod and his family and the aspect of Herodias dancing or getting what he wanted and Salome dancing in front of him, I want to just read a little bit about what this family was like. How many of you know the Willie Nelson song, I'm My Own Grandpa? Have you heard that one? Okay. Many, many years ago when I was 23, and then it ends up with, I'm my own grandpa. I won't sing all the verses in between. And Dan says, boy, I'm sure glad for that. But anyway, Herod's family was like this. Herod had 5 sons, at least 5 sons by 5 different wives. And he murdered 3 of these sons at least. But the Herod the Great was the Herod during the time when Jesus was born. And he's the one that killed the babies around Bethlehem. That was Herod the Great. And Herod the Great then had these 5 wives, and he had sons by those. By one of his wives, he had a son called Herod Philip. Herod Philip married Herodias, who was the daughter of his half-brother Aristobulus, who was therefore his own niece by Herodias. Herod Philip had a daughter called Salome, who is the girl who danced before Herod of Galilee in our passage. Herod the Great then married Malchitha, by whom he had 2 sons. Herod Antipas was one of these sons, who is the Herod of our passage and the ruler of Galilee. The Herod Philip, who married Herodias originally, who was the father of Salome, inherited none of Herod's dominions, but Herod Antipas visited him in Rome and there he seduced Herodias and persuaded her to leave her husband and marry him. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a quiz on this next Sunday as to note who Herodias was. Herodias was the daughter of his half-brother Aristobulus, and therefore his niece. And she was the wife of his half-brother Herod Philip, and therefore his sister-in-law. So Philip married Salome, who was at one time and the same time the daughter of Herod Philip, his half-brother, and the daughter of Herodias, who herself was the daughter of Aristobulus, another of his half-brothers. Salome was therefore at one and the same time his niece and his grandniece. And so we see that the family tree was rather twisted. And to try and wrap your brain around this, it pretty well sends it into a tizzy. So this is the Herod. Herod Antipas is the Herod that beheaded John the Baptist. I didn't quite get all that down. You didn't get. I've gone over this about a dozen times, and I still don't have it quite down either. So anyway, we see that the family was very convoluted. Now, they said Herodias was the daughter of one of the murdered sons of Herod the Great. Herod Philip was one of the sons, a half-brother to one of the murdered sons of Herod the Great. And so he married Herodias, whose daughter was Salome. Herod Antipas then married Herodias also, and I don't know if they killed off the previous husband or whether she just divorced him. Divorce was actually a fairly simple process during those days. You could just say, I divorced you, and I think you had to say it a couple of times to make it stick. But anyway, we see that that Herod now married Herodias, who had been his sister-in-law through a half-brother. So now, why did we've read through Herod and the things about Herod here? What are some characteristics that we see about Herod Antipas, the Herod that is this part of this story here? Okay, John says he was an evil person. All right. Now, Herod the Great was definitely a very evil person. Herod Antipas is now a son of him. Dan. Okay, so John the Baptist and Herod had a relationship. We have a comment back there.
Herod seems to be a little bit wishy-washy and a little bit of a people pleaser.
Okay, Herod seems to be wishy-washy and a people pleaser. Yes.
I was going to say the same thing. He kind of reminds me of Saul. When Saul offered the sacrifice or whatever it was before he should have.
Okay.
He knew he should wait, but he feared the people. And when he saved whoever it was he saved and didn't put him to death and took some of the spoils, he feared the people.
Okay.
And so he knew what the right thing to do was, I believe, but he feared loss for himself, his own reputation, or whatever it was. And I see some of the same here.
Okay. So what makes you think, what are some of the things that make you think that he was a rather wishy-washy person, didn't really stand up for what he knew was right? What caused him to to take John the Baptist and to behead John the Baptist. Yes, Flora. Okay, he didn't want to look indecisive or weak in front of all of the generals and the leaders that he had invited to this banquet. And so he was afraid of them. Grant?
I think it's interesting that it was his lust of Salome that really caused him to make a promise to her of half the kingdom,
Okay.
up to half the kingdom, for anything she risked. It was, to me, it was totally an issue of lust and sexual perversion.
Okay.
Then he had to follow through with it because he made it public.
All right. So he made a promise, rather an impetuous promise, and so he probably spoke before he thought, and so he came up with this, and so he didn't want to back down and say, no, I can't do that, because that would have made him seem weak in front of the people that he had invited. And so he feared what the people were going to say, and so he was willing to go through with this act. And remember now, Salome was actually, depending upon which line you want to trace it, actually his niece or his grandniece. And so she was one of his relatives, and so he didn't want to go against that. Any other comments or questions about Herod and the character that he portrayed? Okay, then we see Herodias. Now, Herodias was married to two of the half-brothers of Herod the Great, and so she wanted to eliminate John the Baptist. Now, the reason she wanted to eliminate John the Baptist was, again, because John the Baptist was pointing the sin that she had committed to her, and so by divorcing her first husband and now marrying the second one, there was sin involved, and so we have this problem. So she was a very bad person. And here is something that, ladies, you can have a tremendous influence on your husbands. You can have an influence for good on your husbands, or you can have an influence for bad on your husbands. And we see that the influence that Herodias had here on John the Baptist was an influence for bad. And even though you might think that you aren't the leader in the home, you don't have the prime, you aren't providing the primary finances in the home or whatever it is, you still are a very significant part of the home and have a tremendous influence on your husband. And pray that God will help you to be that influence that you can be for right. So John the Baptist stood for what was right, and it cost him his head. Not only did it cost him his head, but it cost him, I don't know how many years he was in prison, but that was not a spa that he was at in this prison. This must have been a miserable, miserable place. The cells and so on are still there. You can still go to this prison and see it, and it was truly a forlorn place. So John the Baptist stood for what was right, and he had to pay for it. Any other comments or questions about this particular incident that we have, that we've just gone through?
I just have a location question. So if that's the prison, where's the castle?
Where's the castle?
How far did they have to bring that head? I mean, it sounds like it happened in minutes.
Yes, and I had the same question about this, and we will, let's see. Okay, now the prison would have been someplace over in, no, this, I don't even have it. It would have been down here in the, well, let's find the map. I've got enough of them here. We can find it. There it is. Okay, so the prison would have been someplace in this area that we have here. And now where the party was taking place, it doesn't really tell us where the party is taking place other than the fact that he would have been, his palace was over in, let's see, would have been in this area right in here. And so it's a ways. And so, again, it was not minutes to pick up John the Baptist's head. It may have been a day, a half a day. But the party would have been in Caesarea Maritimus. This is where Herod's palace was. So I don't think he would have been in the palace in Jerusalem at that time. There was a palace there also. He could have been in that palace, which would have been a little bit closer. Jerusalem is right in here, so that would have been a little closer. Caesarea Maritimus is up in this area. So, no. Yeah, and it probably was. This was not uncommon. They didn't have just 1 hour celebrations. If you're going to walk 15 miles to a celebration, you want to have it longer than 20 minutes. And so they probably, most of their celebrations, like their weddings, were a week, and other celebrations were fairly long. Any other comments or questions? I'm happy that I could answer that question so succinctly. Okay, then continuing on with Jesus feeding the 5,000. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Okay, so they came back from their ministry at this time. All right, so they were not involved with this killing that was taking place and with the party that Herod was having. So anyway, we see that they had been out ministering, and they came back and told Jesus about everything that they had done. And he said to them, "Come away by yourself to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Okay, this miracle is the only miracle that is related in all 4 of the Gospels. And so we have feeding of the 5,000, and it just mentioned that there's 5,000 men, which means that there could have been as many as 20,000 people there if there were women and children with them. It's also possible that it was just men, that it was made up of an army regiment or something like this. That's something that has been tossed out also. But we see that it was probably in the spring of the year that this was taking place. And how do we know that this was most likely in the spring of the year? Pardon? They were, okay. What kind of grass? Green grass. Okay, the only time you have green grass in Palestine is in the spring of the year. The rest of the year it's dry and brown. So they were there, and it was late in the afternoon. They had gone across by boat again, and we see that what was the original reason why they went across in the boat? Why did they go in the boat? Where were they going? To a desolate place. And why were they going to a desolate place? To rest alone. They had been doing what? They came back from their ministry. And so they had ministering, they had been walking, they had been talking to people, and you know that just talking to people on a regular basis can become tiring. And I'm finding out now that things that didn't used to bother me tire me a whole lot faster now than they used to. If I drive the bus for 5 hours, I'm wiped out. And so anyway, there are things like that. And so Jesus knew that his disciples were tired and that they needed to go to a place to rest. And so this is where they went. They went to this desolate place, and we see that they had an orderly arrangement. The word that's used here in the orderly rows is a word that was used for how do you plant a garden or a yard. You see your English yards, how they are, and they've got all of the plants in certain order and certain rows and so on. That's the word that is used here, that they sat in these orderly rows. And then it says that they had 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Why did they have 12 baskets? Okay, they had 1 basket for each one of the disciples. So this was a very pragmatic situation, the reason that they had this. Now, we see that it says 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, the 2 fish that they had were probably not northerns or walleyes or anything like this. These were more about sardine-sized fish that they would have had. And so you start dividing this up among 5,000 people, the pieces are going to be pretty small by the time you get to the last one. So they had this. So now we see that there's 2 different ways of looking at this, and one of these is the way the Lord looked at it, and the other one is the way that the disciples looked at it. So first off, how did the disciples look at the people that were there? And the fact that it was late in the evening, they were getting hungry, they had walked a considerable distance to get there, and so how did the disciples want to handle this crowd. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him. This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside. Go to McDonald's and find something there. And so that was their response, that they were supposed to go and do this. Christ's response was what? What can we do for them? Not what can they do for themselves, but what can we do for them? And so we see that they had a totally different response there. And so you can see that the disciples would probably be frustrated when Jesus mentioned this to them, that they were supposed to try and feed them. But Jesus is telling them, don't worry about what you don't have. Use what you do have to be able to minister to these people. And so they had the 2 fish and the 5 loaves, and these, by miraculous means, continued to multiply as they passed them out. So it's one of the things that we need to consider in our own lives. We can think of our shortcomings. What are the things that we can't do? I asked my wife one time, I said, did you realize that I wasn't a very good singer before we got married? And she said, oh yeah. So anyway, that is not something that I admit that I thought about that a lot. And Lord, why haven't you given me the ability to be able to hear these sounds and these pitches and so on? You've given me the voice that I could have, but you haven't given me the ear to be able to use that voice. But see, I shouldn't be thinking about that, worrying about that. What did the Lord give me, and what could I use for the Lord? And so those are some of the things that we need to consider, and that is not what are the things that you don't have, but what are the things that you do have. The disciples had those 2 fish and 5 loaves, and they were able to make this, or God was able to divide this up and to keep them, and they were all satisfied with that. Okay, any other comments or questions that we have? Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it seems like God delights in partnering with us, and that's what was happening here. Jesus didn't say, okay, everybody stand back, and poof, here's the food.
Okay.
He said, okay, you guys, what do you have? Like you said. And it was a small amount. And they gave that gladly in service, obeying what Jesus had told them. And then God multiplied it.
Okay.
Both doing the work at the same time.
Right.
The fruit was outstanding.
Okay, very good. And again, it's a situation that the people need to do what they can do, and God will do what the people can't do. We have the situation of, was it Paul and Silas were in jail, and the doors were broken down, the walls were broken up. What did Paul and Silas have to do? They had to put on their shoes themselves. Jesus didn't put on their shoes for them. God didn't put on their shoes for them. That was something that they could do, and he had taken care of the rest of it. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Adam.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting parallel. In John 6, he says, truly I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that no one may eat of it and die. I find it interesting that they went to a desolate place, which parallels the Israelites when they were in the wilderness.
Okay.
God provided for them.
Okay, all right. So they had the bread provided for them there, and that was miraculous also. That this came down, and it came down in the right amounts. They had twice as much that would come down on the day before the Sabbath so that they could store up for the Sabbath because they weren't supposed to go on out and collect on the Sabbath. And so God not only provided the bread, but he provided it in the proper amounts. And he does the same thing for us. He provides for us in many, many ways, and he provides for us in the proper amounts. I've thought of this sometime. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but what would I have done if I would have had a huge amount of money throughout my life? Being in Christian education for all of my life, I can attest to the fact that I never had a huge amount of money. I was talking with my oldest son, who's a lawyer, one time, and they were talking about how much money I had made when I first started. And Greg says, you know, I make more an hour now than you made in a month when you first started teaching. And so, you know, God has given me that, and he has provided well for me, even with what most people would think was a meager source of income. And I've been so thankful for that. Yes, we have a question at the back.
Isn't it also true in this story then that it wasn't about the money, the 200 denarii that would have been needed?
Right. The 200 denarii was actually 200 days' worth of wages. 1 denarii was a day's wages for a man. And so what the disciples were saying is, even if we had 200 denarii, 200 wages of people, we wouldn't have enough money to provide for this. So how do you expect us to do this? Well, Jesus knew how to do that. Okay, let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for the opportunity that we have being able to study your word. We pray now that you would continue to be with the service to follow, be with Pastor Tim, that you will guide and direct him. Your word would challenge and bless our hearts. We ask these things in your precious name. Amen. Thank you for your participation.